My name is Jack Miller, and I am 22 years old. I grew up in a bustling neighborhood in New York City, the eldest son of a history teacher and a nurse. My sister studies law, always meticulous and precise, while I found solace in the chaos of paintbrushes and sketchbooks. From an early age, I was drawn to art not just as a hobby, but as a way to understand the world and express what words could never capture. My parents nurtured curiosity and compassion in me, yet they often worried about my tendency to get lost in ideals rather than practicality. They taught me the value of knowledge, empathy, and moral responsibility. Despite their caution, I felt a growing restlessness, a desire to do something meaningful beyond the confines of my studio and the streets of New York. The rise of fascism in Europe haunted me. Newspapers and radio broadcasts told stories of governments collapsing, people persecuted, and nations marching toward tyranny. I couldn't stand idle, and I felt a moral pull stronger than fear. I wanted to be part of something larger than myself, to stand against injustice and to bear witness to history as it unfolded. Friends laughed at the notion, calling it naive or reckless. Yet I could not shake the conviction that if I did nothing, I would carry a lifelong regret. This inner fire, fueled by art, empathy, and a sense of duty, became the compass that guided my thoughts. Little did I know the path I was choosing would lead me across oceans, into trenches, and into the heart of a war that would test every belief I had ever held. Europe in 1936 was a continent on edge. The scars of the Great Depression still lingered, leaving economies fragile and populations restless. In Germany and Italy, fascist regimes had risen to power, their rhetoric fueled by nationalism and authoritarian promises. Across the continent, political ideologies clashed violently. Socialists and communists challenged conservative forces, while extremist movements gained momentum in cities and countryside alike. News of these tensions traveled quickly, carried by newspapers, radio broadcasts, and whispered conversations in cafes. In Spain, the situation had reached a breaking point. The Second Spanish Republic faced relentless opposition from nationalist factions led by General Francisco Franco. Cities and villages were divided along political lines. Urban centers leaned toward Republican ideals, while rural strongholds often sympathized with conservative forces. Factories, farms, and universities became hotbeds of debate, agitation, and sometimes open conflict. Civilians found themselves caught in the crossfire, their daily lives transformed by fear, rationing, and the constant threat of violence. Amid this turmoil, the world watched, and many felt compelled to act. The International Brigades, a coalition of volunteers from across Europe, the Americas, and beyond, formed to support the Republican cause. These men and women, united by ideals rather than nationality, arrived to fight for freedom, equality, and justice, even as the stakes grew higher with each passing month. For someone like me, an American barely out of college and steeped in the ideals of art and humanism, the Spanish Civil War represented both a moral imperative and a personal challenge. It was a chance to confront the harsh realities of a world spiraling toward fascism, to witness history firsthand, and to lend my small hand to a cause far greater than myself. I knew nothing of what awaited me, yet the pull of responsibility was irresistible. The morning I left for Europe, the air in our small New York apartment felt thick with anticipation and sorrow. My suitcase sat open on the floor, already half packed with clothes, notebooks, and a few cherished sketch pads. I moved mechanically, folding shirts and tucking in socks, all the while stealing glances at the worn photographs on my desk, reminders of a life I might never return to. My mother hovered nearby, her eyes red from sleepless nights. She offered quiet advice, words laced with both love and worry. Remember to take care of yourself, Jack. No ideal is worth your life. My father, stoic as ever, placed a firm hand on my shoulder. Knowledge, courage, and compassion, these will guide you more than any weapon. Make choices that honor both your ideals and your humanity. My sister handed me a small leather-bound journal. Write everything down, she said softly. Your memories, your fears. One day they will matter more than you realize. As I stepped out into the bustling streets, the city seemed oblivious to the storm brewing across the Atlantic. The honking of car horns, the chatter of neighbors, and the scent of fresh bread from the corner bakery all contrasted sharply with the tension in my chest. With every step toward the train station, the reality of leaving home sank in. The excitement of adventure mingled uneasily with dread, and I could feel the first tremors of fear and hope coiling within me. I did not yet know the sacrifices awaiting me, nor the lessons I would learn in the crucible of war, but I was committed. I was leaving, and there would be no turning back. As the train carried me toward the docks, the reality of what lay ahead began to sink in. I was not merely leaving home. I was stepping into a world I could scarcely imagine, a world where ideals would clash with violence and courage would be tested in ways no classroom or studio had ever prepared me for. The stories I had read of bombed villages, starving families, and soldiers marching into gunfire were no longer abstract. They were becoming my reality. I knew I would face language barriers, cultural differences, and the uncertainty of camaraderie with men and women from countries I had only glimpsed in textbooks. Trust would be fragile, and the bonds I formed would be forged in fire and fear. Every decision, every misstep could mean injury or death, not just for me, but for those around me. Yet beneath the anxiety, a quiet determination stirred. I told myself that my purpose was greater than my fear. I was going to bear witness, to fight for something meaningful, and to learn the harsh truths of a world on the brink. The path ahead was uncertain, but I could not and would not turn back. The docks were alive with the clamor of sailors, stevedores, and travelers, all moving with purpose, yet oblivious to the personal journeys unfolding around them. I stood at the edge of the pier, feeling the salt-laden wind whip against my face, watching the massive ship that would carry me across the Atlantic. The sound of waves crashing against the hull mixed with distant whistles and shouted orders, creating a chaotic symphony that mirrored the turmoil in my chest. As I boarded, I carried more than a suitcase. I carried my ideals, my fears, and the fragile hope that I could make a difference. Every step on the gangplank was a step away from home and into the unknown, into a war that promised both glory and suffering. I glanced back at the receding skyline of New York, the familiar streets and the windows where my family had stood to see me off. I could not foresee the horrors, the friendships, or the sacrifices that awaited me in Spain. Yet, in that moment, standing on the deck with the horizon stretching endlessly before me, I felt a quiet resolve. I was leaving not just for adventure, but for conviction, and there would be no turning back. The moment I set foot on the French docks, the enormity of what I was about to undertake settled over me like a heavy fog. Volunteers from every corner of Europe moved with purpose, their accents a chaotic symphony I struggled to understand. French, German, English, Italian, all blending together, yet united by a single goal: to stand against the tide of fascism threatening to engulf Spain. The ship awaiting us was massive, its steel hull rising above the restless waves. Boarding felt surreal, as if I were stepping into a different world. I carried only a suitcase, a worn sketchbook, and the fragile hope that my ideals would matter in a place so distant from the familiarity of New York. Around me, men and women adjusted their packs, exchanged nervous jokes, and stole glances at one another, measuring courage in silence. As the ship pulled away from the pier, the skyline of the city faded into mist, and I felt a pang of homesickness I had not anticipated. The sea stretched endlessly, each wave a reminder of the distance between the life I knew and the war I was sailing toward. Conversations floated across the deck, talk of battles read in newspapers, fears of injuries, fleeting hopes of camaraderie. I listened, sometimes replying, sometimes simply watching, realizing that we were all bound by uncertainty. In those hours on the open water, I reflected on why I had come. I was leaving behind safety, comfort, and family, drawn by a conviction I could neither ignore nor fully explain. Spain awaited, a land on the edge of chaos, and I was stepping into it willingly, armed only with ideals, curiosity, and a fragile sense of courage that would soon be tested beyond imagination. Arriving in Spain, the reality of war struck me immediately. The streets of Barcelona were alive with tension barricades, posters calling for resistance, and the constant murmur of political debate. I was assigned to a small contingent of the International Brigades, a mix of young men and women from France, Britain, Germany, and elsewhere. The diversity was both comforting and intimidating. We shared ideals, but our languages, customs, and habits were entirely different. The first days of enlistment were a blur of paperwork, uniforms, and weapons familiarization. We were issued rifles, boots, and canvas packs, our new identities marked by the simple insignia of the brigades. I remember the weight of the rifle in my hands, the stiffness of boots that had never walked the rugged Spanish terrain, and the strange pride that came with donning the uniform for the first time. Training was relentless. Dawn reveille brought the cold bite of early mornings, and drills stretched late into the evening. We learned to march in formation, to move quietly through rough terrain, and to dig defensive trenches that would later become lifelines. Shooting practice was harsh. Gunpowder stung, the eyes recoiled, bruised the shoulders, and every missed shot felt like a personal failure. The instructors, veterans of other conflicts, or local Republican fighters demanded precision, obedience, and resilience. Mistakes were met with stern correction, and occasionally, a harsh word that reminded us all of the stakes we were about to face. Yet, amidst the exhaustion and soreness, bonds began to form. I found myself laughing with a Frenchman over a misfired rifle, sharing a chocolate ration with a German, and exchanging whispered stories with a Brit about home. There was a strange comfort in discovering that fear and hope were universal languages. Even strangers could understand the pulse of someone about to step into the crucible of war. By the end of the first week, I realized that training was more than mastering weapons or tactics. It was a test of character. It demanded patience, endurance, and an understanding that mistakes could be costly, not just for me, but for everyone around me. I went to bed each night sore, hungry, and anxious, yet a small spark of determination burned brighter. I was preparing not just to survive, but to stand shoulder to shoulder with comrades I barely knew in a conflict that would demand everything I had to give. The international brigades were a tapestry of languages, accents, and backgrounds. Each morning as we assembled for drills, I heard a symphony of voices: French, German, Italian, English, and a dozen others. At first, it was overwhelming. Commands were repeated, slowly, gestures exaggerated, and questions were often met with puzzled looks. But slowly, patterns emerged. Words were learned signals, understood, and a shared rhythm developed that transcended language. I remember meeting Pierre, a wiry Frenchman with a sharp wit, who often teased me for my awkward Spanish. "You call that marching," he laughed, nudging me as we stepped in unison. Then there was Klaus, a solemn German whose eyes betrayed the weight of his past experiences. He spoke little, but his actions communicated more than words ever could. A young English volunteer, Henry, carried a notebook filled with sketches and doodles, breaking the tension with humor and artistic observations. Together we were a chaotic family, bound not by nationality, but by ideals and the mutual understanding of what we faced ahead. Cultural differences occasionally sparked misunderstandings. A joke that seemed harmless in one tongue might offend another. Meals were another challenge. Each of us clung to familiar foods from home, but soon learned to share rations, adapting to what was available. Despite these small frictions, cooperation became instinctive. In moments of tension, such as setting up a defensive position or navigating difficult terrain, communication relied on gestures, expressions, and trust rather than perfect language. Through these interactions, I began to understand the profound unity that could emerge from diversity. Fear and hope were the common denominators. Laughter, encouragement, and shared struggle created bonds stronger than any shared tongue. I realized that survival in the brigades depended not only on skill with weapons, but on empathy, patience, and the ability to connect across cultural divides. In that chaotic multilingual camp, I discovered a new form of camaraderie, one forged in ideals challenged by differences and solidified by the certainty that we would face the horrors of war together. The day I joined my first patrol, the gravity of the situation became undeniable. Dawn had barely broken, painting the hills with muted shades of gray when our small group was ordered to scout the outskirts of a nearby village. The terrain was unforgiving, rocky paths, winding through scrubland, broken fences, and abandoned farmhouses that bore the scars of sporadic skirmishes. Each step I took was cautious, my senses alert to every sound: the rustle of leaves, distant gunfire, the occasional barking of a dog. Our objective was simple: on paper, observe enemy movements, report positions, and assist civilians where possible. In practice, it was a delicate dance between fear and responsibility. I walked beside Pierre, who whispered instructions in French while Klaus kept a watchful eye on the horizon. Every shadow seemed a potential threat, every movement a signal to act. The rifle I carried felt heavier than before its weight, a constant reminder that mistakes could be deadly. As we approached the village, the first signs of war's impact were evident. Windows shattered, roofs scorched, and debris scattered across once thriving streets. Children peeked cautiously from behind walls, and elderly residents stared with weary eyes, their expressions a mixture of relief and resignation at the sight of the brigades. I offered a smile, unsure if it carried comfort or simply highlighted my own uncertainty. The patrol required constant vigilance. We paused frequently to observe, whispering updates and marking key locations. The wind carried distant artillery fire, punctuating the eerie silence of the abandoned fields. For the first time, I confronted the reality that war was not the abstract concept I had imagined. It was human suffering, fear, and resilience interwoven into every moment. By the end of the day, as we returned to our encampment, exhaustion weighed heavily on our bodies. Every movement ached, every thought haunted by the images of the village. Yet amidst the fatigue, I felt a spark of purpose. I was no longer a distant observer. I was part of the machine entrusted with both duty and conscience. The patrol had tested more than my physical endurance. It had challenged my courage, empathy, and understanding of the world I had chosen to enter. That evening, after returning from our first patrol, I sat on a rough wooden bench and opened the small notebook my sister had given me. The candlelight flickered against the walls of our temporary barracks as I dipped my pen into ink, each stroke carrying a mixture of apprehension and hope. Dear Mother and Father, I write to you from a place both strange and compelling, a land where ideals and reality collide every day. The streets are scarred by conflict, the people weary, yet there is a resilience here that humbles me. I have met comrades from France, Germany, Britain, and despite our differences, we are united in purpose. I described the patrol, the rocky hills, the quiet villages, and the cautious civilians we encountered. I wrote of my fear, though I softened it with the courage I felt standing beside my comrades. I tried to convey not only the hardship, but the sense of duty that drove me forward, hoping they would understand why I had made this choice. In closing, I reminded them that while the world beyond our familiar streets was dangerous, I was learning lessons. No classroom or studio could teach the weight of responsibility, the importance of trust, and the strength found in shared ideals. I promised to remain vigilant, to write when possible, and to carry their love as a shield against the uncertainty that lay ahead. Folding the letter carefully, I tucked it into my pack, aware that each word was a lifeline to home. The act of writing grounded me, bridging the gap between the world I had left and the war I had entered. It was in these quiet moments that I felt my resolve solidify. I was here for a reason, and I would face the challenges to come with conscience and courage intact. As the days turned into weeks, the idealism that had carried me across the Atlantic began to collide with the harsh realities of war. The Spanish landscape, once picturesque in postcards, was now scarred with bombed-out villages, barbed wire, and makeshift trenches. Each patrol, each skirmish revealed the indiscriminate cruelty of conflict and the vulnerability of civilians caught in the crossfire. I observed men I had laughed with days before now, silent, their faces etched with fear and fatigue. I watched the elderly and children endure hunger and terror, and I realized that no textbook or lecture could have prepared me for this. War was a living, breathing entity. It consumed without discrimination and spared no one from its lessons. Yet amidst the suffering, there was resilience. The Republican forces, though outnumbered and outgunned in many instances, displayed ingenuity and determination. Local militias adapted to guerrilla tactics. The international brigades learned quickly from veterans and civilians, found ways to survive and resist. I began to understand the broader historical stakes. Battles like Madrid and Jarama were not isolated events, but pivotal moments in a struggle that could shape the fate of an entire continent. Through these experiences, I also discovered the true value of camaraderie. Trust and reliance on my comrades became as critical as any rifle or ration. Fear was constant, but it was tempered by shared responsibility, shared ideals, and the unspoken understanding that we were each other's lifeline. I realized that courage was not the absence of fear, but the capacity to act despite it, guided by conscience and the bonds formed in adversity. By the end of this initial period, I had come to a sobering conclusion. War would challenge every belief I held, every assumption about morality, justice, and human nature. But it would also teach lessons of loyalty, resilience, and empathy that no peaceful life could offer. Spain had become both a crucible and a classroom, shaping me in ways I could not yet fully comprehend. And with this awareness came a deeper commitment to the cause and to the people whose lives intertwined with mine in the uncertain days ahead. Dawn broke over the dusty hills near the Jarama River, painting the landscape in pale, trembling light. The air smelled of damp earth and gunpowder, a constant reminder of the violence that had already scarred these fields. Our unit had been assigned to hold a forward position along a ridge overlooking a small village, an area critical to the Republican defense. I gripped my rifle tighter than ever, aware that the weight of it was nothing compared to the responsibility I carried for the lives around me. The first shots rang out before we had even finished our morning preparations. Machine guns raked the ridge, and the staccato of rifle fire echoed from the tree line. I dropped into the nearest trench, my heart hammering every sense hyper alert. The ground trembled under artillery shells, sending clouds of dirt into the air, mingling with the acrid smoke of burning timber. My comrades shouted instructions, their voices cutting through the chaos, and I struggled to make sense of the torrent of noise and motion. A sudden explosion sent my ears ringing and dirt into my face. I scrambled to help Pierre, who had been thrown to the ground by a nearby shell blast. "Are you okay?" I yelled over the din, checking for injuries. He nodded, blood streaking his cheek, eyes wide but alive. Around us, men were falling, some screaming, others eerily silent. I felt a chill run down my spine. Each life lost was a reminder that ideals could not shield anyone from death. We returned fire, advancing cautiously through the shattered remains of the ridge, using whatever cover we could find. Every step seemed to last an eternity, every movement a gamble. The village ahead was on fire, flames licking the sky as civilians and fighters alike fled or huddled in ruined buildings. I caught sight of a child peering through a shattered window, eyes wide with fear. I wanted to turn away to shield myself from the suffering, but I knew that retreat was not an option. Survival demanded action even when the heart rebelled. Hours passed in a blur of smoke, shouting, and fear. I fired until my shoulders ached, checked on wounded comrades, and carried messages between squads. Each encounter tested me, forcing rapid decisions that could mean life or death. By late afternoon, the firing subsided, leaving a heavy silence broken only by the distant cries of the injured. The ridge we had fought so hard to hold was ours, but the victory was hollow. The cost was etched in every face. I saw the pallor of fear, the grime of blood, the exhaustion that refused to lift. That night, as we huddled in the trenches, I wrote a few lines in my notebook by candlelight. I tried to capture what I had seen, but words felt inadequate. War was not the heroic adventure I had imagined. It was a relentless crucible, burning away innocence and exposing raw human fragility. And yet, in the shared glances with my fellow volunteers, I found a flicker of something enduring: courage, resilience, and the quiet determination to face whatever the next day would bring. The aftermath of the battle left the ridge strewn with the remnants of lives interrupted too soon. Bodies lay tangled among broken rifles and splintered timber, and the acrid scent of smoke and blood hung heavy in the air. I moved cautiously, each step a struggle between duty and dread, checking on comrades who had gone silent amidst the chaos. Pierre was fortunate, only a shallow cut across his cheek, but others were not so lucky. I found Henri, the young Frenchman who had joked moments before the shelling slumped against a shattered wall, his breath shallow and uneven. Despite frantic efforts to staunch the bleeding, it became painfully clear that he would not survive the night. I could feel the weight of helplessness pressing against my chest, a cold realization that courage alone could not shield anyone from death. The cries of the wounded and the silent grief of those who survived formed a chorus I could not escape. We gathered the injured, lifting them onto makeshift stretchers, and whispered words of comfort, though none could erase the horror we had witnessed. Conversations were sparse. Each of us seemed trapped in our own private reckoning, struggling to process the loss while maintaining the fragile thread of resolve that bound us together. In a rare moment of stillness, I sat beside a fellow volunteer, Lars, an older man from Denmark who had survived numerous battles. "It never gets easier," he murmured, eyes distant. "You just learn to carry it with you." I nodded, understanding without needing further explanation. The battlefield had stripped away any illusions of heroism, leaving only raw survival, shared suffering, and the necessity of perseverance. Letters and memories of home surfaced, unbidden faces of family, friends, and quiet streets of New York, now seeming impossibly distant. I wrote Henri's name in my notebook not as an exercise in recording history, but as a silent act of remembrance, a gesture against the erasure of life that war demanded. Every loss became a somber teacher, imparting lessons about courage, loyalty, and the limits of human endurance. By evening, as the sun sank behind the scarred hills, a grim calm settled over the ridge. We huddled together, exhausted, watching the smoke curl from the distant village. Despite the despair, a silent bond had strengthened among the survivors, an unspoken promise that we would continue for the fallen and for the ideals that had brought us here. Yet, beneath that resolve, a lingering doubt gnawed at me. Could ideals survive the relentless cost of human life? Or would we too eventually be consumed by the very war we had chosen to fight? It happened in the afternoon while we were consolidating our position on the ridge. A sudden mortar shell exploded nearby, throwing dirt and debris in every direction. I felt a sharp sting along my left arm as shrapnel tore through my sleeve. My first instinct was to cry out, but the chaos around me left no room for hesitation. I staggered to the nearest trench, heart-hammering blood warm against my skin, realizing for the first time how fragile life truly was. Pierre was immediately at my side, dragging me toward cover. "Hold still, you're gonna be fine," he shouted over the roar of gunfire. I wanted to believe him, but a cold dread spread through me, a quiet terror that whispered of death, lurking too close to ignore. The world had shrunk to the small circle of safety in that trench, the trembling earth beneath us, the smoke curling in the wind, and the faces of comrades who were just as raw with fear and adrenaline. A field medic arrived, kneeling beside me with practiced efficiency. His hands were steady, voice calm. "You'll live," he said, cleaning the wound, applying bandages, and offering a few words of reassurance. The physical pain was sharp but tolerable. It was the mental weight, the sudden awareness of mortality that pressed hardest. I had imagined war in abstract terms as a series of heroic acts or ideological battles, but this was immediate, visceral, and unforgiving. As I lay there partially hidden from the enemy, I reflected on how quickly life could shift from routine to peril. Every decision mattered, every second counted. I had witnessed men fall beside me, some silently, some screaming, and now I too was a vulnerable body among many. Yet even in that vulnerability, a strange clarity emerged. Life became intensely precious. Trust in others, courage under fire, and the capacity to act despite fear were what defined survival. By nightfall, my wounds stabilized, and I was moved to a safer area behind the lines. I sat quietly watching the ridge dim under the setting sun, thinking of those who had not been so fortunate. For the first time, I understood the full cost of war, not just the immediate fear, but the lingering psychological toll, the knowledge that every day could bring injury or death. And yet, amidst the fear and pain, a resolve solidified I would continue, not just for myself, but for the comrades I had lost and those still fighting beside me. Life on the ridge was a relentless cycle of fear, exhaustion, and survival. Each day began before dawn, the chill of early morning seeping through my uniform and into my bones. Rain often turned the trenches into mud-filled canals, and the constant cold made sleep a fleeting luxury. Food was scarce, stale bread, watered-down soup, and the occasional tinned meat, but it was enough to keep us moving. Water, too, was rationed, and every sip tasted like a hard-won treasure. The sounds of war never ceased. Mortars and artillery echoed through the hills, mingling with the rattle of machine guns and the occasional distant scream. Smoke and dust hung in the air, coating our skin, hair, and lungs. Even when a brief silence fell, the tension never truly eased. Each volunteer knew that danger could erupt at any moment, that death might arrive from a sniper's bullet or a stray shell, and that our lives were precariously balanced on the edge of chaos. The physical toll was matched by the psychological strain. Comrades fell ill from exhaustion, hunger, and exposure. Rats infested the trenches, and lice thrived in our uniforms. I saw men lose control of their nerves, shouting in fear, weeping, or becoming eerily silent, their minds retreating from the unbearable reality. I felt moments of despair, wondering how long a person could endure such relentless stress and still retain a sense of humanity. Yet within these horrors, small acts of compassion persisted. Volunteers shared what little they had, extra rations, blankets, a whispered word of encouragement. A soldier would cover another with his coat when the rain pierced through, or quietly steady a trembling comrade as artillery fire rained down. These moments, fleeting and fragile, were reminders that even in a world consumed by destruction, empathy, and solidarity could survive. At night, we huddled in the trenches, exhausted and cold, listening to distant gunfire and the occasional shout. Sleep came fitfully interrupted by nightmares or the sudden sound of enemy movement. Each morning, the process repeated, rising, marching, patrolling, observing, firing, enduring. The ridge became both a battlefield and a classroom, teaching lessons about fear, endurance, courage, and the limits of human resilience. By the end of those weeks, I had grown more aware of my own capacity for pain, patience, and adaptation. War was not the romantic, heroic adventure I had imagined. It was a crucible that tested the body and spirit alike. And yet, through the shared suffering, the bonds of comradeship, and the quiet determination to survive and protect one another, I discovered the deeper meaning of endurance, courage, and loyalty lessons that would remain with me far beyond the battlefield. The horrors of battle soon forced me to confront choices I had never imagined. One morning during a skirmish near a burned village, I spotted a wounded comrade lying exposed in the open. Advancing to help him meant risking my own life, yet leaving him could cost his. My mind raced duty to the mission, clashed with loyalty to a friend. Every second felt stretched, each decision weighted with life and death. Elsewhere, I witnessed acts that challenged my sense of morality. A civilian family cowered in the remnants of their home, terrified by crossfire, yet the chaos of war made it impossible to protect them fully. Rebels and nationalists alike made choices that blurred the lines between right and wrong, forcing me to question whether ideals could survive amid bloodshed. I realized that war was not a series of clear-cut battles between good and evil. It was a chaotic tangle of survival, fear, and impossible decisions. In another instance, a senior officer ordered our squad to hold a strategic position, knowing full well that casualties would be high. Arguments flared. Some volunteers refused, citing humanity over duty. I felt torn, caught between obedience and conscience. Could I follow orders without compromising the values that had driven me to Spain? The weight of this question pressed down on me with every step, every glance at my anxious comrades. Through these experiences, my perspective shifted. I began to see that courage was not merely physical, but moral as well, the ability to act rightly under impossible circumstances. I learned to navigate uncertainty, balancing idealism with the harsh reality of survival. The rigid notions of heroism I had once held crumbled, replaced by a nuanced understanding that valor could take many forms, comforting a terrified child, carrying a wounded friend to safety, or simply standing firm when fear screamed to run. By the end of the battle, I understood that war demanded more than bravery. With a rifle, it required empathy, judgment, and the willingness to bear the burden of morally complex choices. Each action, each decision was a thread in the fabric of who I was becoming. The battlefield had begun to reshape not only my skills as a soldier, but my understanding of humanity itself. Amid the relentless shelling and chaos, bonds began to form that transcended nationality, language, and background. Pierre Klaus and Henry became more than comrades. They became lifelines. We shared rations when supplies were low, offered quiet encouragement during patrols, and instinctively watched each other's backs. In the maelstrom of gunfire and smoke, friendship became a strategy, a shield against the overwhelming isolation of war. I recall one night as rain poured into our trenches, our boots and clothes soaked through, we huddled together for warmth. A stray shell exploded nearby, shaking the mud beneath us. Despite the fear, we laughed quietly, finding solace in small human moments, a shared joke, a whispered memory of home, the comfort of knowing we were not facing the horror alone. In that laughter, fleeting though it was, we reclaimed a fragment of our humanity. During patrols, we communicated through gestures and glances, understanding one another without words. When Henry faltered, anxious about crossing a dangerous field, Pierre extended a hand, steadying him, and I followed suit. Every act of mutual support reinforced the fragile thread of trust that held us together. I began to realize that survival in this war depended as much on these invisible bonds as on rifles or tactics. The bonds were tested repeatedly. When a sudden mortar strike sent dirt and debris flying, we instinctively formed a chain to carry the wounded to safety. Exhaustion, hunger, and fear could have easily broken us, yet the presence of each other provided a strange, sustaining strength. I discovered the depth of resilience born from camaraderie, the courage to move forward even when every instinct screamed to retreat. By the time dusk fell, casting long shadows over the shattered landscape, I understood a profound truth. Friendship under fire was not merely comforting, it was essential. It transformed fear into action, despair into determination. In those shared moments of vulnerability and bravery, I learned what it meant to truly depend on others, to trust despite uncertainty, and to fight not just for ideals, but for the people who had become my family amid the war. As night fell over the battlefield, a heavy silence settled on the ridge. The smoke from burning villages lingered, mingling with the cold wind that carried the distant echoes of gunfire. I sat alone for a moment, my rifle resting across my knees, and tried to process the events of the day. Faces of fallen comrades, the terrified villagers, and the chaotic frenzy of battle swirled in my mind. Every memory was etched with a stark clarity that only trauma could bring. I realized with a mixture of sorrow and understanding that war was neither heroic nor clean. It was messy, brutal, and unrelenting, testing every physical, emotional, and moral fiber within me. Courage was not a constant state, but something that emerged in fleeting moments when lifting a wounded friend, advancing under fire, or choosing to act despite paralyzing fear. I understood that every decision carried weight, and that survival was as much about vigilance and judgment as it was about skill with a rifle. Yet, amid the destruction, I also recognized the enduring power of human connection. The friendships forged in trenches, the acts of solidarity under shell fire, and the shared laughter and fleeting moments of respite revealed a side of humanity that refused to be extinguished. These bonds became both shield and compass, guiding me through the physical dangers and moral ambiguities of war. For the first time, I could see the war not merely as a series of battles, but as a crucible shaping who I was becoming. I had entered Spain as a wide-eyed volunteer driven by ideals and distant notions of heroism. I emerged from this ordeal altered, more aware of fear, loss, and suffering, yet also more attuned to resilience, loyalty, and the subtle forms of courage that define survival. As I lay back against the cold earth exhaustion weighing on me, I knew that these lessons would endure far beyond the ridge, far beyond the battlefields of Spain. The war had begun to transform me, and whatever lay ahead, I would carry these realizations into the uncertain days to come. The physical toll of war became undeniable in the weeks following the battles. My arm still bore the scar from the shrapnel wound I had sustained at Jarama, a constant reminder of how close I had come to death. Small cuts and bruises from the trenches and the relentless march through mud and rubble left my body aching day after day. Sleep was elusive. Even when I managed a few hours in the makeshift bunks behind the lines, nightmares of exploding shells, fallen comrades, and screaming villagers invaded my rest. Psychologically, the weight of the experiences began to press heavily. Every sudden noise made me flinch, every shadow seemed to harbor danger. I found myself reliving moments of terror repeatedly. The images of the wounded and the dead burned into my mind. The line between courage and recklessness blurred as instinct and fear dictated every decision. Nights were the worst. The darkness amplified the horrors I had witnessed, and I struggled to reconcile the idealism that had brought me to Spain with the grim reality of survival. There were moments when the fear became almost unbearable. A patrol could leave me trembling for hours, and yet I knew that hesitation might cost a life my own or someone else's. I began to understand the hidden costs of war, the invisible injuries that left no scar, but weighed on the mind, eroding confidence, hope, and sometimes sanity. And yet, through all this, a determination persisted. Each wound, each sleepless night reinforced my commitment to my comrades and the cause. I realized that survival depended not only on physical resilience, but on mental fortitude, the ability to act despite fear, to endure despite exhaustion, and to carry forward the memory of those lost as motivation rather than despair. The battlefield had reshaped me, embedding lessons about vulnerability, endurance, and the fragility of human life that will remain long after the echoes of gunfire had faded. The losses weighed heavier than any wound. Names, faces, and voices of fallen comrades echoed in my mind long after the smoke of battle had cleared. Henri, who had laughed with us mere hours before the shelling, Pierre's quiet determination, and others whose presence had made the harsh days bearable, all were gone. Each absence left an ache in the pit of my stomach, a reminder that survival came at a cost that no ideology could justify. I spent hours writing in my notebook, not just recording events, but trying to make sense of the grief. I listed names, jotted down memories, and traced moments of courage that had saved lives only to be confronted with the inevitability of death. The act of remembering became both a ritual and a refuge, a way to honor those who could no longer speak for themselves. The emotional burden was relentless. I would wake at night to flashes of the battlefield, the sounds of gunfire, and cries of the wounded invading my dreams. Moments of laughter with friends now felt like distant, fragile fragments of a life that no longer existed. I found myself questioning the cost of our mission, wondering if the ideals that had driven me to Spain were worth the price in blood and sorrow. Yet within this grief, I discovered resilience. The memory of my fallen comrades became a silent motivator, urging me to carry on to fight and to protect those still alive. Shared mourning with the survivors forged bonds deeper than any laughter or camaraderie could have. We were united not only by ideology, but by loss, and it was this connection that kept us moving forward through exhaustion, fear, and despair. By acknowledging the grief, I learned that sorrow and courage could coexist. The battlefield had taught me that to survive, one must honor the dead, not by forgetting, but by continuing to act with integrity, compassion, and resolve, carrying their memory as both burden and inspiration. The war demanded choices I had never anticipated, each one steeped in risk and consequence. One morning, I was presented with a decision that would alter the course of my service. A group of civilians had been trapped near a contested village, their escape blocked by enemy fire. I could either accompany the squad on a dangerous reconnaissance mission or stay behind to help guide the refugees to safety. The risk was immediate. Either option could cost lives. I hesitated, weighing duty against conscience. My rifle felt heavier than ever, a tangible reminder of the responsibility pressing down on me. Choosing to protect the civilians meant missing vital intelligence for the command, potentially endangering the mission. Ignoring their plight could preserve military strategy, but at the expense of human life. In that moment, I understood that war was not simply a matter of orders and ideology. It was a constant negotiation between morality and necessity. Ultimately, I chose to help the civilians. Together with a small team, we led them through muddy fields and shattered roads, keeping low to avoid sniper fire. I felt the weight of each life in my hands, the trust placed in me by strangers whose survival depended on decisions made in seconds. The experience reshaped my understanding of responsibility. Survival was not only about one's own life, but about the lives entrusted to you and the courage to act rightly even when fear pressed hard. In the weeks that followed, my role evolved. Commanders, recognizing my aptitude for quick judgment under pressure, assigned me to assist in training new volunteers and providing support to injured comrades. The change in responsibilities was challenging. I was now a mentor, a guide, and occasionally a medic, balancing frontline engagement with care and oversight. Each new role demanded adaptability, empathy, and decisiveness, qualities I had scarcely needed in civilian life, yet now defined my existence. Through these transitions, I learned to navigate the complex interplay of duty, morality, and survival. War no longer seemed like a sequence of battles, but a continuous test of character. Every decision carried weight, and every action was a lesson in leadership resilience and the moral ambiguity of human conflict. I began to understand that adapting to new roles, embracing responsibility, and making hard choices were as vital to survival as any rifle or strategy. The broader currents of the Spanish Civil War began to press down on us with increasing weight. Republican forces were slowly losing ground in critical areas despite valiant efforts by both local militias and the international brigades. Franco's nationalists, bolstered by German and Italian support, employed increasingly sophisticated tactics and heavy artillery, forcing us to adapt constantly. Each skirmish became a test not only of skill but of endurance as the scale and intensity of the conflict escalated around us. For me, these developments were not abstract. The loss of strategic positions meant that our small unit faced harsher conditions, longer patrols, and higher exposure to enemy fire. Villages that had once offered temporary shelter were now ruins, and civilians suffered under both the bombardments and the chaos of retreating forces. The war's consequences were immediate and visceral, affecting every decision we made. The stakes were no longer theoretical. Survival, moral responsibility, and the lives of those around us were intertwined with the outcomes of battles we could barely influence. In this climate, I witnessed the harsh reality of international politics intersecting with human life. Requests for reinforcements or medical aid were slow to arrive, and our commanders often had to make decisions with limited resources. The disparity in power between the nationalists and our forces highlighted the fragility of idealism when faced with overwhelming material advantage. Yet despite the setbacks, we continued to fight, driven by a mixture of conviction, duty, and the bonds we had forged amidst adversity. The war's broader consequences seeped into our daily existence. Casualty lists grew longer, rationing became stricter, and morale fluctuated like the weather over the hills. I felt the weight of history pressing upon me. Our actions, though small in the grand scheme, were part of a larger struggle for Spain's soul. Understanding these dynamics shaped how I approached every decision, whether guiding refugees, tending to the wounded, or executing orders under fire. It became clear that surviving the battlefield was inseparable from navigating the moral and practical complexities imposed by the larger conflict. Through these experiences, I recognized the inescapable truth: individual courage and sacrifice were vital, but history's currents could overwhelm even the most steadfast volunteers. This awareness tempered my idealism with realism, preparing me for the difficult choices and enduring consequences that lay ahead. The experiences of the past months had transformed me in ways I could scarcely have imagined. Each battle, each patrol, each decision carried lessons far beyond tactics and strategy. I had entered Spain a young volunteer, brimming with idealism and eager to fight for abstract notions of justice and freedom. Now I understood that survival, morality, and human connection were just as vital as any rifle or plan. I had learned to endure pain and exhaustion without surrendering. The aches from wounds and endless marches had taught me patience, while the constant presence of danger honed a vigilance I never knew I possessed. But it was not only the physical challenges that shaped me, it was the psychological crucible of fear, loss, and moral ambiguity. I had faced moments when any choice seemed wrong, when acting or standing still could each bring death. In navigating these situations, I discovered resilience, courage, and the subtle strength of making morally conscious decisions under pressure. The bonds forged with my comrades became a central pillar of my growth. Pierre Claus Henry and others had taught me the importance of trust, loyalty, and shared responsibility. I realized that courage was not solitary heroism. It was mutual support, protection, and empathy amidst the chaos. Survival depended as much on these relationships as on skill with weapons or tactical awareness. My perspective on war itself had shifted. Where I once saw it as a stage for ideals, I now recognize it as a crucible testing every aspect of humanity. Yet, in this crucible, I had glimpsed the enduring capacity for compassion, bravery, and hope. Each challenge had reshaped my understanding of myself, my limits, my priorities, and my capacity to act in alignment with both principle and reality. By reflecting on these lessons, I felt a quiet confidence in my ability to navigate the trials still ahead. I understood that the war would continue to demand sacrifices, confrontations with fear, and ethical dilemmas. But I also recognized that each experience had strengthened my judgment, deepened my empathy, and refined my understanding of what it meant to truly survive and contribute. Growth was not measured in victories or accolades, but in the ability to face hardship with integrity and emerge changed yet unbroken. As the weeks drew on, I found myself reflecting on everything the war had demanded of me. The injuries endured, the friends lost, the moral decisions weighed, and the relentless challenges that had tested both body and spirit. Each lesson was etched, deeply shaping the way I moved, thought, and felt. I had come to understand that survival was not merely a matter of skill or chance, but of adaptability, judgment, and resilience. In quiet moments behind the lines, I prepared for what lay ahead. I checked my equipment, ensuring that rifles were clean, packs were packed with rations, and supplies and notes were secured in my journal. But preparation was not only physical, it was mental. I rehearsed scenarios in my mind, visualized patrols, engagements, and emergencies, and reminded myself of the responsibilities I bore toward my comrades and the civilians whose lives intersected with ours. I also reflected on the psychological burdens I carried. Sleep remained elusive, nightmares frequent, and memories of the fallen weighed on me heavily. Yet, I realized that acknowledging these burdens rather than suppressing them strengthened my resolve. I was not invincible, but I could endure, learn, and act with a measured sense of purpose. The battles ahead would be as unpredictable as they were dangerous, demanding courage, empathy, and sharp judgment. I accepted that uncertainty was inevitable and that control was limited, but I resolved to face each challenge with the skills and understanding I had cultivated in the crucible of prior experiences. Each step forward would be guided by lessons from both loss and triumph, by the bonds forged in adversity, and by a deepening awareness of the human cost of war. As I prepared to move with my unit once more, I felt a quiet steadiness within me. The next phase of the conflict awaited, and though fear remained, it was tempered by knowledge, experience, and the unwavering commitment to stand alongside those who had become my family in the midst of chaos. I was ready as anyone could be to face whatever the war would demand of me next. The war finally drew to a close, though not in the way I had hoped. The Republican forces had crumbled under the relentless advance of Franco's nationalists, and the villages we had fought to protect lay in ruins. Standing on a shattered ridge, I watched the smoke curl lazily into the gray sky, a haunting reminder of lives lost and dreams extinguished. The air was thick with silence, broken only by the occasional distant shout or the faint whistle of wind through the broken trees. Leaving Spain was surreal. I carried with me not only a backpack filled with meager belongings, but also the weight of memory friends who would never return, families scattered, and the countless civilians whose fates we could not change. Each step away from the battlefield was heavy with grief, yet threaded with relief. Relief at surviving, relief that the war had ended, but also a deep, gnawing sorrow for everything and everyone left behind. As I crossed into France, the familiar landscape offered a fragile comfort, yet the scars of Spain clung to me. I felt changed, marked by experiences that could not be erased. The ideals that had brought me here remained, but they were tempered by the reality of what war truly demanded. I had survived, but survival was only the beginning. The lessons, the losses, and the memories would accompany me for the rest of my life. The physical scars of the war remained long after I set foot on safe soil. My arms still bore the remnants of shrapnel injuries, my shoulders ached from years of carrying packs and rifles through uneven terrain, and my legs carried the bruises and strains of endless marches. Yet it was the invisible wounds that proved hardest to bear. Even months after returning, sleep was elusive. The crack of a distant firework or the creak of a door could send my heart racing, conjuring memories of artillery and falling comrades. Nightmares visited regularly, dragging me back into trenches and rubble, forcing me to relive screams, explosions, and the faces of friends I could never forget. Everyday moments were colored by an underlying tension, a vigilance that had become second nature during the war. I grappled with the weight of survivor's guilt. The memories of those who had fallen pressed heavily upon me, a constant reminder of the fragility of life and the randomness of death. Yet I also recognized the resilience I had developed, an ability to endure, to carry on despite pain and fear, and to act decisively when faced with challenges. These lasting effects shaped the way I approached the world. I was no longer the wide-eyed volunteer who had stepped onto the docks months earlier. I was a man marked by experience, tempered by loss, and profoundly aware of the cost of ideals in a violent world. The war had left an indelible imprint, a mixture of strength and vulnerability that would accompany me for the rest of my life. Looking back on my time in Spain, I began to understand the true cost of ideals. Peace was no longer an abstract notion, it was a fragile, hard-won state preserved only by the courage and sacrifices of those who had fought for it. Every life lost, every injury sustained, reminded me that freedom and justice were never granted lightly, and that responsibility to others was inseparable from personal conviction. I reflected on the friends who had fallen beside me, on civilians whose lives were irrevocably altered, and on the countless moments when moral judgment had been tested. Their sacrifices were not in vain. They were lessons etched into my very being, teaching me about empathy, resilience, and the weight of human responsibility. I realized that to honor them, one must carry the memory of their courage forward, striving to protect the values for which they had endured so much. The war had shown me that ideals alone could not shield anyone from suffering, but they could guide action in the midst of chaos. True responsibility, I understood, meant acting with conscience and care even when faced with danger, loss, or uncertainty. These reflections shaped not only my perception of conflict, but my understanding of life itself, reminding me that peace, sacrifice, and duty were intertwined, and that the lessons of war could and should inform every choice I made thereafter. Even now, years after leaving Spain, the memories linger as vividly as the day they were forged. I can still feel the weight of the rifle in my hands, hear the distant thrum of artillery, and see the faces of friends who will never return. The war shaped me, marking my body with scars and my mind with memories that cannot be erased. Yet, alongside the pain and loss, there is an enduring sense of what it means to be human. I learned that courage is not always loud or celebrated. Often it is quiet, shared in small acts of protection, support, and compassion. I discovered the depth of resilience, the value of trust, and the profound strength found in solidarity with others who share both fear and hope. As I reflect on the path I walked, I understand that the true legacy of conflict is not merely in the battles fought, but in the lessons carried forward. The memories of those lost are now inseparable from my own life. Their sacrifices inform my choices, temper my fears, and guide my actions. I carry them with me, not as burdens, but as beacons, reminders of the fragility of peace, the necessity of empathy, and the responsibility we bear to protect what we hold dear. The war has ended, but its imprint remains. It is a reminder that even amid destruction, humanity can endure, that ideals, though tested, can survive, and that the lessons learned in the crucible of conflict about courage, sacrifice, and moral responsibility are treasures to be honored for the rest of one's life.